Glad I got that out of the way. Now that we're in part 2, let's start up this ranking again by talking about another major property that's kind of essential to WB's identity in terms of animation. So without further ado... Well, it was only a matter of time till I talk about the LEGO movies on this list, which, considering their status, I'm super excited to talk about them on here. The bad news is I have to start with the one that I didn't see when it came out, and that is Ninjago. The strange outlier of the LEGO movies, and it does admittedly show in comparison to the other LEGO movies. For starters, this movie feels less connected to the other LEGO movies. Like, I think the Green Ninja makes one appearance in the first LEGO movie, and that's it. They don't reference this movie in the LEGO movie 2, and we don't see any of the characters from the other LEGO movies appear in this. Hell, as far as I'm concerned, this movie has no ties into that Ninjago TV show either. I mean, as far as I know, because I've never seen the show. Maybe it does, I just don't know. I'm sure there are some Ninjago fans that can confirm this. I'm sure some of you are out there. There has to be some reason why the show still hasn't been canceled. Seriously, it's still going on after like over a decade. What the hell? But as someone who just watched this movie for the first time and nothing else, this is another mostly fine kids film. People are a lot harsher on this movie because of how good the other LEGO movies are, and it does feel like a definite downgrade in that regard. It doesn't have any sort of really clever message or commentary like the main two LEGO movies do, nor does it become a big fun-filled parody and celebration of an iconic character like LEGO Batman. It instead goes a more typical sort of route with its story. It's a father-son dynamic where the father is the main villain and the son is the main hero, and it plays out similarly to what you expect about them learning to get along and get that father-son bond they desperately need. It mostly plays out pretty alright story-wise, but fairly standard, and not quite as funny as the other LEGO movies. There's still some humorous bits here and there, including a screaming goat gag that actually kind of worked pretty well for me.
Goat!
Though there's still a lot of jokes that go on a little longer than needed, which does make it on the lower end of LEGO movies. The animation is still just as good as ever, still taking advantage of the LEGO world with some good use of stop motion like animation, and even some really good looking backgrounds that make this still a visually pleasing movie to watch. Though, I also wish this film was stronger in its characters too. Most of them don't really have the same impact as the other LEGO movie characters, even if they are played decently by some good actors, including Jackie Chan being the obvious highlight. If there's any other complaint I have, I do think the ending does feel a little rushed. Like, it's mostly about the father-son duo getting along, which is fine and dandy, but without spoiling too much, they kind of make it end up being more about the son apologizing to the dad, when for a movie like this, it should have been vice versa. I get that respecting the parental figure is important and all, but I don't know, for a movie like this where the villain is the father, they really should have gone the other way, especially when that kind of stuff has been working really quite well for recent animated films, with having the parent be the one to apologize. So kind of makes me wish they did something like this here. Regardless though, it's ultimately a harmless kids movie that's not as good as the other LEGO movies. We'll talk more about this franchise a bit later when we get to the better films of the bunch, but as it is, Ninjago is just okay. Nothing too special, but an alright watch for kids who are into Legos. Anyone else is just better off watching the other LEGO movies due to how more ambitious and worthwhile they are as animated films. While a fine movie is one thing, I always have a preference for when an animated movie does something really outside of the box, even if it doesn't always work, which coincidentally enough, that's a good way of describing the next couple of movies I'm going to be talking about on here. So...
You want osmosis? You got osmosis.
Will Smith Smith just smacked the shit out of me.
A movie that's stranger than any disease case involved in this story, Osmosis Jones is one of the strangest films to be remembered, despite it being a huge box office bomb and it being very divisive among people. For me, that divisiveness is still prevalent here because I find myself very mixed on Osmosis Jones. There are things to admire in this, but also some flaws that cannot be ignored at all. Let's start with what is bad about this movie. And yes, spoiler alert, it is the live action parts. Not because it's live action, not even because the live action parts completely overshadow the movie, because they are relevant here. No, not at all. The live action segments in Osmosis Jones commit a crime that's arguably unforgivable, and I can't fault people for hating this movie for these sequences alone. And that crime is making Bill Murray the worst part of your movie. This is another movie that combines live action and animation, but this time the live action segments are played out like a gross out comedy, hence being directed by the Academy Award winning team behind Green Book, the Farrelly brothers. Not a bad way of being a live action animation hybrid, but what ruins it is just seeing Bill Murray degrade himself in gross out humor that emphasis more on the gross out than the humor. But really, it's not even him dealing with gross stuff is what makes these moments so bad, even though it can be very hard to watch for some of these disgusting moments. It's more so the fact that the character of Frank is just a completely unlikable asshole. He's not only gross, but he treats his daughter like crap, needlessly mean, and is just careless throughout the whole movie. Imagine watching a Simpsons episode dealing with Lisa and Homer, but suck all the charm out of it. I know that's also the point, because this character is supposed to learn to be healthy, but you gotta have some sort of charisma to him, and this character has none. There's a scene near the end of this movie where he's on his deathbed, and his daughter is of course upset, and it's all emotional, but I don't really feel bad for this character at all, since his daughter is the one in the right here, so to see her act like this is her fault when it's really just this jerk's incompetence to why he's here in the first place doesn't feel earned at all. I care more about the characters that appear inside Frank's body than I do Frank himself. Speaking of which, let's actually get to the part everyone remembers, and for me, the parts of the movie I actually really like. The whole animation section of this movie that's inside the body of Frank is actually really cool. They basically turn what we know about human anatomy inside the body into one of the coolest and stylized cities in an animated movie. The colors and movements are so vibrant, and given that they are cells, it creates for very exaggerated movements. Granted, while this idea is nothing completely new, in fact, Pixar may have done it a lot better in some aspects with Inside Out, along with Cells at Work, which I have not watched, but the version seen in Osmosis Jones is unique enough, emphasizing more on it being like an actual city than anything in Inside Out, making it still stand out on its own without those projects being complete rip-offs either, despite what some people may say. As for the story itself, it serves its purpose well as a standard buddy cop movie, with Jones being the risky old-timer, and Drix being the play by the rules yet better at his job police officer. It's not the most original dynamic in the world, but both Chris Rock and David Hyde Pierce do have a good chemistry with one another and play off each other really well. They help make an already engaging world still entertaining to witness. However, they don't quite steal the show for me. If Bill Murray manages to be the worst part of the movie, I gotta give them credit for making Lawrence Fishburne freaking awesome in this film.
Careful, I'm contagious.
Drax is one of the coolest bad guys to ever appear in a non-Disney animated project. This dude has one goal: to kill Frank and become the most powerful disease in the world, and he stops at nothing to get his way. The determination of this character certainly makes him threatening, and possibly even scarier today, with the rise of diseases being more of a threat than ever today. His design is devilish, and Lawrence Fishburne's performance gives this character a badass edge to him. Every single scene he's in is absolute gold, and this movie wouldn't nearly be as good without him. So overall, Osmosis Jones isn't a great movie, but it's one of those movies I admire a lot for its originality, style, and how it manages to be very unique as an animated film. With a great animation style, decent leads, and an awesome villain, Osmosis Jones is one of those ambitiously flawed films that I honestly enjoy. But I just recommend maybe fast forwarding the parts with Bill Murray if possible. Makes the experience of this much more bearable.
What you doing there, boy?
I'm happy, Pa.
What you doing with your feet?
They're happy too.
Now we're talking something truly out there. The first Happy Feet is some anomaly of a movie. It's another hugely divisive animated movie, and for various reasons. Namely because this is a weird, odd mesh of dancing penguins, sexual references,
Let's talk about eggs, baby. Let's talk about you and me.
jukebox musical, environmentalism, and anti-religion. And no, I'm not kidding about that last part. But Happy Feet is a movie directed by George Miller. Yes, that George Miller. The man behind the Mad Max movies. But he also had a huge part of creating the movie Babe, which is actually one of my favorite non-animated kids movies ever. What made Babe so good and still holds up today is, while it is a kids movie, it doesn't shy away from being surprisingly darker and more mature with its themes, and showcasing those themes in a way that's actually very understandable for kids, but also holds up better as an adult when you realize what the initial intention of these themes are. Happy Feet almost goes in that route, because this is a movie that isn't afraid to be bold and get kinda dark with its themes of environmentalism and anti-religion. Okay, the anti-religion angle is slightly exaggerated.
Raise your voices, brothers! Give praise to the great Gwyn! He put songs in our hearts and fish in our bellies!
Keyword being slightly. Most of the religious stuff is more of an allegory, but it does fit into the theme of Mumble wanting to express himself and be who he is, despite him not going with the crowd. The elders see this idea of different thinking as a way of disrespect to their way of life, when in reality, there's way more to the world than their way of life, since their closed-mindedness is the reason why they've been in trouble with the situation they've been in for as long as they have. While it is weird, and maybe not the most subtle about it, but it does make sense to the story and overall message of the film, which I think works. But what about the rest of the movie? Well, it is odd, and not quite Miller's best. But you know, I appreciate how big and grand this movie is, especially for the time. The way this movie makes this story about these penguins feel so larger than life, especially with what they're dealing with, along with all the realistic environments that look pretty great, especially for the time. Yeah, some of the penguins look a little dated now, but everything else still has this big sense of scale that it's an impressive looking directorial work, especially when you consider the detail that George Miller put into it, even going as far as still making each center point of the scene still be perfectly centered in the shot with its main characters. As for the characters themselves, well, they're not the most well fleshed out, but I think they all serve their purpose pretty well. They fulfill the quotas of this story, and Mumble serves as a decent, likable lead and is voiced by Elijah Wood. In fact, I don't think the voice acting here is too distracting with the celebrity voices compared to other animated films. The highlight, in my opinion, being easily Robin Williams, who's, of course, pretty funny as the two roles of Ramon and the sex machine himself, Lovelace. And yeah, this movie is weirdly horny in the mix of all the cute penguins and environmentalism. All of the strange horniness and the singing animals have just really made me think of one thing. Honestly, George Miller should have directed Cats. And no, I'm not kidding. Which, on the topic of the singing, the music in this isn't bad. Granted, it is a jukebox musical, so not a lot of original songs showcased here. But as far as covers go, they're not bad and fit the movie okay. The songs are still very upbeat and even sung very well, mostly by the late Brittany Murphy. And this was also way before the whole trend of jukebox musical really got tiring among films in general, animated or otherwise. The music does lessen more as the film goes on, and it gets darker with its themes. And while it is a strange movie, I admire a lot of the ambition and care Miller and his team did with this film. Strangely enough, this is the only film on the list to have won the Academy Award for Best Animated Picture, and I say it kinda deserves it. Granted, that's partially because that was a relatively weak year for animated movies, but it being such a big animated film, not from Disney, and even tackles some issues of identity, religion, and environmentalism in a compelling way, makes me really dig the first Happy Feet as this interesting animated project from Warner Brothers. Do I think George Miller deserved an Oscar for a different movie? Well, yeah, have you seen Mad Max Fury Road? And with its placement on the list, I can also point out some animated movies on here that also deserve the Oscar more than Happy Feet. But I am glad that Happy Feet, for as big as it is, still managed to be a very unique project for the time compared to other animated movies. And one from a director that clearly has a lot of passion to his work. Maybe someday George Miller will work on another animated film, and I'll look forward to when that day finally comes. But for now, I can appreciate what him and Warner Brothers brought with the original Happy Feet. Flaws and all. This weirdly strange piece of work about penguins is one film that's an interesting watch that's also a bit of a toe tapper as well. Definitely worth your time if you haven't seen it yet.
He says, welcome to the frickin' Guardians of...
So we just finished talking about a well-recognized iconic director making an animated film that's known for crazy over-the-top violent films and crazy energy with George Miller and his Penguins extravaganza. But he's not the last least likely director to have an animated film from Warner Brothers that's about birds, as now we're going to talk about the one and only Zack Snyder. Fortunately, going to be no insane Twitter debates about how the Snyderverse is returning, cause I'd rather not do that. Instead, let's talk about one of the reasons I consider him to be an underrated director with this pretty good movie about owls. Legends of the Guardians, The Owls of Ga'Hoole is a movie I enjoy for similar reasons to Happy Feet. It's a rather ambitious and grand animated film that kind of showcases some of the best strengths of a popular director. Unlike Happy Feet though, I kind of enjoyed the vibe and tone of Legends of the Guardians more. It's a little more consistent at least, with it not being a musical and instead sticking with being this very dark, big adventure throughout a good majority of its runtime. One thing I can definitely say about this movie is that it is breathtakingly gorgeous from an animation perspective. Not only does this movie look better than both Happy Feet movies and is one of Snyder's best looking movies visually, it's also one of the best looking movies I've seen that does a great job of replicating realistic looking animals. The textures and movements on these characters look perfect, and they don't forget to make these owls have some really good expression without making them look too cartoony. It's yet another reason why the Lion King remake fails in that regard, as this movie came out in the year 2010 and it looks so much better than that piece of shit. As much as people give Snyder crap for his use of slow-mo, it actually is used to great effect here, because with the amount of effort given to making these environments and characters look real, you can really soak in every single bit of detail when it slows down. Another strength to this movie is that tonally, this movie works really well. It's not really filled with a lot of childish or ridiculous moments, as there's a strong sense of tension with the threat looming over these characters, and they take things pretty seriously. It helps that this movie feels a lot more mature than the average animated adventure movie, so there's more appreciation when something like this treats its audience more like adults. Except for the part where they had to use a pop song for a musical montage that doesn't fit with the rest of the movie at all. It's only one scene in the movie, but it feels pretty distracting, especially when you consider the band playing the song is Owl City. Get it? 'Cause they're owls! Outside of that one moment, this is an animated movie that definitely warrants its PG rating. From a visual and tonal level, this movie is every bit as incredible and grand as something like this should be. So this movie should absolutely be amazing, right? Well, not quite. It's one of those movies I would say is good overall, but could have been a great one. And make no mistake, this movie is still one of Snyder's best movies. In fact, probably in his top 3 actually, if you ask me. there are a few elements that make this movie not as engaging as it should be. And for me, it really boils down to the characters here. Most of them serve their purpose just fine, but there's not as much to them as there should be, which is a shame considering how good these characters look visually, and also how good the voice acting is in all of this. It really focuses on the main owl, Soren, who does get a decent amount of time focus on here, and to his credit, I do like the progress of him becoming a stronger warrior. Really, the issue I have more so is with his brother, Clud, whose whole arc feels pretty rushed as he ends up becoming evil and the main rival. I get what they're trying to do here, as they're making his transcendence to evil all through being a part of this cult that constantly discusses the greatness of their power. It showcases how truly manipulative they can be, and how really easy someone who's rather innocent can be persuaded into being a part of a movement that's truly corrupt. Considering how much we see that more nowadays, his whole arc has become a bit more believable in that regard, and it does make for an interesting dynamic. But even with that in mind, it still feels like it could have been fleshed out a little more. Like, maybe a little bit more emphasis on the tragedy of this situation, or maybe more time to where we see Clud become more corrupted into his descent as this villain. It would have been something that could have been expanded upon with a potential sequel, which I don't think will happen anytime soon. I mean, it's not DC related, so Zack Snyder fanboys aren't demanding Warner Brothers to restore the universe of the Owls of Ga'Hoole, unfortunately. Though I have to give credit where credit is due, and I thought Zack Snyder did a pretty good job with this film. If nothing else, Legend of the Guardians is a neat and different kind of project I'm glad came into existence. It could have been an even stronger movie, but for a movie that has a lot of ambition and craft to it, I say it's definitely worth your time. See, like I said, Zack Snyder managed to achieve more with this movie than whatever the hell Disney gave us with that Lion King remake. So, let's move on.
Look out for Mr. Stork, that persevering chap. He'll come along and drop a bundle in your lap.
Of all the WB Bird movies we have on here, I think Stork stands out as the best one of the bunch. It's definitely the most distinct of the films, not going for a more realistic and grand approach, but instead being a more cartoonish and wacky film about the world of storks. Though for the kind of movie it's aiming for, this works quite well. It does end up being a typical sort of Ice Age story of making sure a baby gets taken to the right owner, and it being a buddy-buddy movie with two contrasting leads and how they have this life-changing adventure, but it feels a lot better than that. I say it's mostly due to both of the leads in this film and this movie's sense of humor. The two main characters are very charismatic, with Junior and Tulip. They're not the most original characters, with Junior being the overconfident lead who has to learn to get along with others, and you have Tulip, who I swear reminds me a lot of Frankie Foster from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. Yet I find both of these leads to be pretty likable due to how well they work off of each other, and the animation and performance given by their respective voice actor make these characters incredibly expressive. In fact, the animation is one of the big pluses about this movie. It's one of those very cartoony movies that embraces its more outlandish look, by making the majority of humor focus on the exaggerated features of the animation. Plus, unlike Smallfoot, this film is a lot more varied with its character design, and even the type of characters they utilize here. Not everyone is a winner in this cast, like there's this kind of annoying lackey bird that isn't too funny, and just has moments that make the film longer than it needs to be. Yet the rest of the cast of characters also serve the story and humor for this very well too, including Kelsey Grammer playing the antagonist businessman of the film, who's really good at being this evil character while still maintaining a level of professionalism with his nature. There's another stork played by Danny Trejo who's also quite funny as this manic obsessive stork who's gone crazy, and you even got Key and Peele here voicing the leaders of this wolf pack who all just form these random vehicles and objects that create for a lot of hysterical set pieces. The whole movie is filled with these great funny set pieces, with my personal favorite sequence being one where they have to sneak around quietly, and all the humor is based around the expressions and actions, creating for a very clever sequence. Not Not to mention, this movie does ultimately have a good sense of heart to it. It is focused on family, of course, and how it can pretty much be from anywhere. Nothing too new in terms of themes, admittedly, yet the execution does emphasize the importance very well, showcasing a variety of different families, from single parents, big families, gay couples, etc. by the end of the film, all leading to a pretty touching climax that shows as long as that family can bring love and care to one another, that's the most important thing more than anything else. It's not the most original or new movie, but what they do with it really works, as Stork can be best described as cute. Maybe a typical word used for a kids film like this, but in the case of a movie that has a huge emphasis on humor, visual, and of course cute babies, there's not a whole lot of better words to describe it than cute. It makes for a really nice family film that's worth your time if you want an animated film that's just really fun and expressive. Don't be afraid to accept any sort of gift from these storks if you check out this film. Not much else to say. So enough about birds. Let's go on to talking about someone who can really fly.
Guys, there it is. Look who's finally ready to play.
Let's see if I remember how to do this.
Yeah, of course the original Space Jam is still better than a new legacy. I still don't think the sequel deserves the hate it gets, but at the same time, the first one is so much better. And I say namely for one reason. The fact that the first one was pretty simple and more to the point. Sure, cramming all of these WB IPs wasn't too far off from being a product-based film, but at the same time, there's a nice simplicity to just having a movie about the world's most famous basketball player playing against Bugs Bunny. It's fun for being kind of the standard sports movie with a cartoony edge to it. The film still has some great animation and even some really fun, memorable moments that kind of help made Space Jam stand the test of time. It's a classic for being this weird phenomenon of its time, and even if you tried to recreate that in a sequel, it wouldn't quite match as well. For as bizarre of a movie as it is, it still holds a place in cinema history. I already made a video talking about it, so I don't think I need to go that much further here. Space Jam is a fun movie that definitely isn't a great movie, but really has this distinct nostalgic charm that only the 90s had to offer. Though real talk, we all know the main reason it's over Space Jam 2 by a mile. It's because of how hyped that soundtrack is.
Come on, it's time to get hype, say who?
You know you love it! But what if I were to tell you that there was a Looney Tunes animated live-action hybrid film that's actually better than both crossovers with Bugs Bunny and the NBA All-Stars? Well, no better time to do that than now.
Hold everything. Daffy gets blasted. Page 7, Daffy gets blasted. Page 8, Daffy gets blasted. Duck. Again!
Yeah, Looney Tunes back in action is better than both Space Jams. This movie is a fun adventure that does a better job capturing the spirit and craziness of the Looney Tunes. The film was directed by Joe Dante, best known for Gremlins. And you could not have picked a better person to direct this movie. Joe Dante has always been known for being a huge fan of these characters, just from the amount of stuff that influenced the zany kind of nature he has in his films. Hell, it's pretty apparent by the amount of times the Looney Tunes have been outright featured and referenced in his movies. He's the best person to create a Looney Tunes movie, and luckily, this movie comes very close to being the absolute perfect film featuring these characters. Rather than being a basketball sports film, it's more about Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck going on a worldwide road trip to stop the main villain from making everyone in the entire world turn into NFTs. Good move, since I couldn't think of anything else more sinister.
And remember, no one wants to be turned into a monkey.
It's a simple plot as an excuse to get these characters to do their crazy shenanigans that we're all used to, all with some of the best animation I have seen featuring these characters. Not only do the characters move very expressively thanks to the incredible work by legendary Disney animator Eric Goldberg and his team of animators, but the characters even have an interesting look as they look a little more three-dimensional with the right amount of shading and texture to them, which helps them fit better into the live-action scenery. And the combination between the two is done pretty seamlessly. It stays more true to what the Looney Tunes are, with being less about it being a marketing ploy, but instead a film filled with gags and character interactions. Except for the part where they go to Walmart at one point in the film.
Nice of Walmart to provide these Walmart beverages in return for us saying Walmart so many times.
So this sounds like the perfect Looney Tunes film, though I said almost the best Looney Tune movie, as this film does unfortunately fall short in a few areas. Despite the commentary on the studio meddling, this film had a troubled production with how Dante and the producers wanted to see focus on this film, leading to the film ultimately getting mixed reviews. And there is a fault the movie has that can make it feel weaker than it is, and those are the human leads. They're not awful, as Brendan Fraser and the other lady do a fine job, but they feel more like they're in a standard family comedy, where the main appeal here is the Looney Tunes. There are parts that focuses on them, and it's not bad, but it just makes you wish that it was more consistent at being a film about these lovable cartoon characters. But in all intents purposes, the film still manages to be a fantastic Looney Tunes movie, as when it focuses on the tunes, it is some of the best that these characters have ever dealt with. It's worth it alone for the painting chase sequences with Elmer Fudd. Despite the production issues, the film still really turned out good because it still had a lot of what Joe Dante's vision was. To quote the Royal Film Ocean's excellent video essay on Joe Dante,
again, it's almost like leaving talented people alone to just do their thing results in really great films. Who would have thought?
if Dante was able to create the vision he initially wanted to make, you bet this movie would be much higher on the list. But for what it's worth, the director that was perfect to direct a Looney Tunes movie still made the best Looney Tunes movie out there, and that's a great accomplishment to celebrate. Well, since this video series has been going on a lot longer than I initially anticipated, I'm actually going to split this into one more part, so stay tuned for part 3 very soon. But until then, don't forget that David Zalvez is a fucking asshole who needs to get fired at Warner Brothers because he hates animation for no reason. And that's all, folks!
Go home, folks.